This is University Lecture. Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, LaDonna Harris, Comanche member of the National Council for Indian Opportunities and wife of Senator Fred Harris, speaks on urban Indians. This is the sixth in a series of special programs recorded at Iowa State University's National Affairs Institute devoted to the American Indian. Mrs. Harris.
I really am pleased to be invited to this seminar and this lecture series. I'm very flattered, and I want to compliment this university and the group of students and faculty members who were involved in this program. It means a great deal to me personally to see that this university and the location of this university is interested enough to have this kind of program. In complimenting you, I'm reminded some of the stories my husband tells, and I'm usually the straight man for his stories, that in complimenting you, that he always says, a politician should always ingratiate himself with whatever group he's with, and so he usually starts off, by complimenting or saying nice things about where he is. He said, though he was broken of the habit when our daughter, Catherine, who now is a university student herself, but when she was a child about 12, we were sitting around the dining room table, and the Comanches, I'm a Comanche Indian, by the way, the Comanches and the Kiowas, and the Apaches had just received a settlement from the federal government, and it was amounting to something like $72 apiece, real big money. But as my husband said, any money, that's what he thought he was marrying. When he married me, he thought he was marrying a rich Osage, and he married a poor Comanche. But he said, what are we going to, that he and the children and I were sitting around the table and said, what are we going to do with the money, with our Indian money? And Catherine looked up to him and said, well, Daddy, said, what do you mean we? You're not an Indian. So he has to ingratiate himself. He said he's a real minority in our family since he's the only one that's not an Indian. But it really is an outstanding thing that you're doing here at this university with the amount of Indian population. I wished I could be as proud of my own state as I am of what you're doing. We have, I say, the largest population of Indians in the state of Oklahoma, but many other, we get in this argument with New Mexico, so they have more. But we are not on reservations in Oklahoma, and so it's kind of hard to tell how many Indians there are in the state. To tell you a little bit about what the subject urban Indians, I think I need to tell you a little bit about myself and kind of how I got into the whole urban Indian picture. I was actually born on a farm in Cotton County, Oklahoma, which is rural Oklahoma, which was the property of my grandparents. It was their land, her land allotment. In Oklahoma, we don't have reservations, which I mentioned, and every woman and every child member of the Indian community received at the opening of the land 160 acres. That's with the exception of some of the Cherokees who got really smaller amounts of land. But as you know, Oklahoma was called the land of the red man, and was on the eastern side of the state is made up of what is referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, which were the tribes that were forced to move from the East Coast to eastern Oklahoma. And on the western side of the state are the rest of us. And there are 68 different tribes of Indians in Oklahoma. And when I say the rest of us, meaning that we are so different, we are very different than the eastern side of the state, since we are Plains Indians and nomadic by our culture and quite different lifestyle. And with that kind of background about the state of Oklahoma and my own, when the state was open for statehood, Indians received 160 acres, and then the lands are opening. You might remember the Sooners and the Boomers, rushing into the state and picking 160 acres. Well, I grew up, my mother married an Irishman who apparently couldn't stand a mixed marriage because it was a mixed marriage at that time, and a very great deal of social pressures upon people. And so he left and went to California, which was a big migration to California, as you will recall, during the Dust Bowl days. And my mother went to work at an Indian hospital as a nurse's aide, and has worked there, and just recently retired, worked there all of her work life. So I grew up with my grandparents being my grandmother and grandfather still living in a more or less traditional way. My grandfather particularly, who never converted to Christianity, wore long braids, and though he wore Western style clothing, he wore a hat much like Lee Brightman, whom you saw earlier. The large rounded crown with maybe a little bit of feather in his hat. And my grandmother wore the long dress. She is still alive, and always had a great deal of influence on my life. She wears her hair in braids and the long dress and shawl. And though she was one of the first Christian converts in our community, in fact, I think she was the second by the American Baptist mission that arrived in our area. But my grandfather never accepted it, and he was a peyote man, and we grew peyote at the farm, and he used it for medicines and for religious purposes. And he would drive us to church every Sunday, but he would sit outside the church and never go in. And I think it's the mixture of that background that I come from that gives me some different feeling and maybe a broader outlook, and I think, than a lot of people of my age group that grew up in that community, because it was a very different experience than most people. I grew up with my aunts and uncles who were like brothers and sisters, and my cousins, and all Indians have this kind of relationship that I know my, I'm down to the 11th cousins who are 11th removed, and but they're like first cousins, whereas my husband hardly knows his first cousins. But all that Indian family is such a great force for reinforcement for Indian people, and unfortunately that is breaking down like all our family ties are. But it was meant a great deal to me to have the Indian family, though I didn't have, quotes, the style of life that most children my age were having, but that having all that family was reinforcing. I would go, and if they weren't relatives, in an Indian way, they were relatives. I would walk down the street with my grandmother, holding her hand, and her in her long dress, my aunt and I, and people would come up to me and pat me on the head and say in Comanche, "Oh, my little granddaughter." And I would say, "Grandmother, how are we related to them?" And she would smile, big smile, pleasant smile come over her face, and she said, "Oh, that's my sister." And I said, "Your sister, Grandmother? I know that's not your sister." And she said, "Oh, yes." And then she would go into this long kinship relationship where they were good friends. She was a good friend to that person's mother, which made her sister. And so you were, as a Comanche particularly, you were related to everybody that was in the tribe. And I think you'll find that most tribes are like that. But growing up in that atmosphere and knowing children my own age, and particularly probably the brightest young people who drop out of school and then into alcoholism, made you wonder, and you get tired of people asking, I get tired of people asking me, well, how did you make it out of those kinds of circumstances? And I really give a great deal of credit to my grandparents, and of course mostly to them and to other relatives who reinforced me and helped me do some things that I probably would not have been capable of doing without their reinforcement. But seeing, kind of growing up with a sense of this all happening around you, and growing up in a mission church, and grandparents have to deal with the BIA and deal with the rest of the community, because we were actually members of a community. You took a lot in, and growing up hearing some of the slur words that were used in that area of the country, like gut eaters and discriminatory remarks that were made to Indian children, and myself included. It gives you a sensitivity that maybe sometimes has driven people to alcohol or to other ways of protection. I've found that in Indian community, mostly because of Indian cultural background, that we don't have the same kind of protective mechanisms that most people have or brought out in families, that to protect ourselves from disapproval, that we will avoid all kinds of situations. And then, so when a child doesn't recite in class, the teacher thinks he's an ignorant child, and mostly because he's afraid of embarrassment, or afraid of ridicule, that he won't recite. And so it's just kind of a chain reaction that happens to people that destroys them. So and probably I would have not been involved, except at the University of Oklahoma, my husband became very interested, and he said he took a course in anthropology so that he could understand me better, because I had particular characteristics that I weren't aware of. For instance, that I would ask for something, and he said, well, where is it? And I would point to it. And he said, well, where is it? Point to it. And I said, I am. And I just couldn't understand him not seeing me point to it. And when in Comanche culture, and particularly most of the plains, and probably most tribes, that you do not point with your hand. If you point with your finger, that's accusing someone of something. So you point with your mouth, your lips. And so he said he had to take this course so he could understand what I was doing. But it did give him a great deal of sensitivity and a great deal of interest, kind of whetted his appetite. And because of that, then he became interested. And when he finished his law degree and we moved back to our hometown, we went out and visited with my relatives. And I had an uncle and aunt who had a mission church, and it was a great uncle who preached in Comanche. So he learned to speak the language and sings and dances actually better than I do. And so he helped me keep my interest in pride in being an Indian. And he said what he enjoyed most was when any member of the Comanche tribe saw him, they would refer to him as, here, there's our son-in-law. And he was very pleased with that until our son was born, and then he was referred to as the father of our grandson. So he didn't particularly like that title as well. But a nice thing happened, and that's why I'm really pleased that this university is interested. We had a human relations seminar at the University of Oklahoma, and I was invited. And it was curious at the time. The discussion was more on labor management relationship. These are human relations studies, and how labor and management could better get along, and just getting into the black-white human relations, and started talking about that. So I brought up Indians. This is Oklahoma, to be appropriate. We have the same percentage of blacks as we do Indians in Oklahoma. And I said, well, what about Indians? And they said, well, what about them? The Bureau of Indian Affairs are taking care of them. And I said, no, I disagree. And said, how many dropouts do we have in Oklahoma? How many Indian children make it to college? How many do we have here at OU? So we just kept asking questions, and finally I got very irritated. When I become angry, I cry. And I got very emotional because there was another Indian man there who was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in an Indian school there in Oklahoma. And he would counteract. He would disagree with what I was saying. So I became very angry and said, well, let's make a field trip to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And we went down from Norman to Anadarko. And in advance, we set up, and these were most of the people that were there at this human relations conference had PhD degrees, or they were in the field of social work, working on their PhD degrees at least. And so we had someone call and make appointments in advance. And when we got there, none of the people that we made appointments with were there. And just all the things that I had said that would happen, and worse. We got no information about what was the Indian situation in that area of the tribes of the Western state. And all of us, and it was worse than I had pictured it to them. So this gave the group an incentive and kind of backed me up. And then we started speaking, looking into this problem. So we made a field trip to Oklahoma City to see if we could find out any information there. And we got all kinds of replies. We went to the police department and the welfare, and we got replies like, yes, there's an Indian ghetto, and there's even an underground where they're smoking peyote, and there's, then we say how many arrests, just real, you just can't imagine the kinds of comments. And that welfare, no, they weren't very many people on welfare because they really didn't, one thing, they didn't know how to get on welfare. Another thing, that within the Indian community, people would take care of themselves, and there are no illegitimate children, for instance, in the Indian community as far as the Indian community is concerned. The other community might think they're illegitimate, but the Indian community doesn't. And so these are the kinds of information which really brought out the picture. There was no information from a federal agency that was designed especially to supposedly for the welfare of American Indians could not give us any information. The city officials, any state officials in Oklahoma City couldn't give us any information. So we didn't know exactly what to do with this, and so I suggested, why did we start a pilot project in our hometown? So we did, and this all kind of came about in this way, and we started from that project to a statewide project. And as I mentioned, in Oklahoma, there are 68 different tribes, and it's always interesting, and particularly when you go to a university or a large institution like a university or a foundation, to get them involved on a project. In a state like Oklahoma, or even on a national basis, they'll say, well, why don't you Indians get yourselves together and pick out a leader? And, so one spokesman for all the Indians in Oklahoma say. And there's 68 different tribes. Do you understand what 68 different tribes of Indian? That's 68 different groups of people who are speaking 68 different languages, having 68 different cultures, very separate cultures. It's like when you say tribes, you make the reference of, you can make the same comparisons to talking about Europeans. When you're talking about Indians, you could say Europeans because the language and culture are that much different. The skin coloring, but used to, you could even tell where Indians come from by their physical. I used to be pretty good at that, and if they came from the eastern side of the state or the western side of the state, or if they were Navajo. And you met Mr. Gigamo, who is a Kiowa, and I used to tell a Kiowa from Comanche. And of course, Mr. Gigamo is, and being a Kiowa, he and I have a special rivalry. And that's another thing that it's hard for non-Indians to understand, the rivalry between the tribes. That your first prejudice that you grow up with is against another tribe of Indians. And yet as mature as I think I am, when certain names of tribes are said, I have mental images of descriptions that my grandmother described those tribes. But we have this friendly, sometimes hostile relationship with the Kiowas, and we're very strongly intermarried. But we fight a lot. But to say, to really say that, why don't you get one leader to speak for you? Or, say when she doesn't speak for Indians or he doesn't speak for Indians, it's just like, one person is speaking for the whole of Iowa, or even worse than that, the United States, because of the varied backgrounds and cultures. But I give you this little bit of background, hopefully, to kind of bring you into the picture of how I arrived at what, about the urban Indians. After we started or tried to develop in Oklahoma a statewide organization called Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, OIO. And when we did that, our purpose was to have one meeting and kind of describe what OEO was going to do and learn and try to encourage the Indian community to be involved in community action programs and be on the boards. Well, it just took a few minutes to look around, and you could see there were no Indians getting on the community action boards. And so Oklahoma not fitting all the categories that we do not have a reservation and all of that, we could not get OEO monies from, quotes, the Indian desk. So we had to come around and get a work-study program and an educational training program and do all kinds of different things. So, this just kind of describes what Indian people have to go through, which is kind of addedly more difficult, and particularly urban Indians have to go through. We have to develop all kinds of programs to even get the federal government to respond. So and I feel that we've been very successful in many things we did with this program. So when my husband went to Washington, and I was there and had an opportunity to look around, and one of the things we rapidly found out that half of the Indians in Oklahoma were in Oklahoma City and Tulsa. So made you believe that certainly there were a lot more Indians. We heard about the Indians in Chicago and San Francisco just slightly. And so then I started looking around and traveling with my husband, started making inquiries and looking around. No information whatsoever. And of course the census is so terribly wrong now. We say there's 1 million Indians in the United States. And so after a while I got very confident, because no one can object to what you say because nobody knows. And so I went around saying there, at least half the Indians in the United States are in the urban areas, and no one's talking to that problem. And so, no one would pay any attention at the time. And then the National Council of Indian Opportunity was set up under President Johnson, a program that President Johnson set up, and I was appointed on the board, and I asked for to have special hearings on urban Indians, and we set up 4 cities to have hearings on. And I remember going to San Francisco, and Lee Brightman's questions on me. If you've had a chance to hear Lee, he's can be very articulate and pretty hard on you if he wants to be. And so he raked me over, and you get to think about it, very well justified. Why are you another government group coming out, another there's a song out by Floyd Westerman, sending a task force down from Washington. And I said, nothing probably will come out of this, but other than maybe one fact that government agencies will be aware that there are Indians in the urban centers. And the interesting thing is that we're taken for everything other than Indians in urban centers. In California and Texas particularly, we're taken for Mexicans and Orientals on the West Coast. And just, no one imagines. Everybody has the stereotype of all Indians being on reservations, living in hogans or teepees with war bonnets, or in hogans with war bonnets on, which is all wrong. But the kinds of the stereotype that even the government officials believe, and in places like University of Oklahoma and other institutions of higher learning or whatever the term is, that didn't know anything about American Indians when they had the highest Indian population in the country. So and that's really what came out of the urban Indian hearings that I held about 3 years ago, was the fact that it did help to focus some national attention from federal agencies to urban Indians. And we've now had 2 presidents of the United States make speeches on urban Indians, speaking directly about that problem, but up to now it's mostly been rhetoric, that nothing has happened actually from agencies, though we've heard from HEW and OEO that they are supposed to start thinking about funding and that an Indian is an Indian wherever he is, and he doesn't have to necessarily live on a reservation. So that was kind of one of the things that we did. Holding hearings were in these places were, I just can't really tell you what an emotional strain it was on me, physically and emotional. Having hearings all day and having people stand up and tell. To give you the interesting thing about we all know about the migration to the urban areas by all peoples. The interesting thing about the American Indian is that the federal government has had the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the federal government, has had a program of what is called relocation. And the relocation program was to take the Indian off the reservation and find him a job in the city and put him there. Well, we've had that now, I think something like almost 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. And the first 5 years were totally disastrous. We're doing better. We're about 50% success now. We're doing better. The government's doing better. But there were no preparation for people moving. If you can imagine the problems that any peoples have moving to the city and adjusting to an urban life like San Francisco. Los Angeles has the largest Indian population, urban Indian population, and it's the largest concentrated Indian population outside the Navajo reservation. So you can get some sort of mental image of that. San Francisco has the second, and then Chicago, Dallas, and Denver, Seattle, Cleveland, Phoenix, and but there are quite a few, just scattered throughout, mostly in large industrial areas. And the government would relocate these put Indians, find them a job, and then leave them. And then it was a total failure, so they gave it a new name, and they put some training into it, but it's still, there's not enough kind of follow-up. We've really not learned enough from the mistakes that were made. And all the people that were damaged in the meantime, I have a cousin who was one of the only men that the only person that I knew that really relocated successfully, when I have many other cousins, though, that came back home. And again, that adds to the Indian's failure image, and he becomes which he's become much accustomed to. And this is his chance for a new start and everything, and then it just finds it totally impossible. And for lots of reasons, and probably Mr. Brightman and John Trudell will really could tell you more, because their lives have been in San Francisco. Just to give you kind of an example of what the hearings were like. To have the people stand up, old and young people, mostly younger people, stand up and tell you about the problems they had. The college kids about the only place they have for socialization they didn't have. They had they had an Indian center, but it was down on I guess you would call Skid Row Street, and I may be putting down Brightman's town. I don't know if I'm saying the right things, but it's on the street where all the bars are. The Indian Center is, and we find, and that was what you find in the urban centers. The only place for socialization was at the bars. So certainly you would go to the bars and visit, and because you get to see another Indian. And this is, I remember I told you the best thing that happened to me was the reinforcement of my Indian family, and so Indian people. They're always in Washington. There's bars in Washington where the Bureau of Indian Affairs employees go for socialization. There's bars in all these towns where Indian people go for need for reinforcement. I tell you this particularly because I want to tell you I came full circle. And when I first started out or tried to start something or try to help to do things, I started out that I thought that Indian centers were terrible. I was for integration, and I wanted total integration, and I really had to back up on all of that. Now you hear, great white liberals who are saying, why are people wanting to be separate? But I found this out several years ago that what the need was and why it had to be that way. That we really do need the Indian centers. You need them funded properly. They need to be with health units and referral services and services there to reinforce the Indian and help him become more of that community in which he lives. But all kinds of things happened after a very emotional set of hearings, people testifying and really crying, getting very emotional, arguments within the groups of people that were there, all of the things that you can imagine happening during the day. And so the young people said, here you are in this hotel, which was a good criticism, and we thought we were being very clever because we thought we were avoiding a faction fight within the Indian community in San Francisco when we decided we'd just have it in a public hotel. But then it turns out the hotel wouldn't allow you in without a tie in the bar downstairs, and how many of the people there could afford to have a tie, really, and who really wanted to wear one or needed to wear one. So it really, and we were justifiably criticized. And so some of the young students asked me to go down to the Indian Center, and I said yes, I would. And we went down and had a hamburger at one of the Greasy Spoons, and then walked down that street. And I saw one of the women who testified at the hearings, an Eskimo woman who was, I thought, very impressive. And we were I was walking down the street, and she was sitting almost like Linda. It was just right inside the door of this bar. And so I said, well, let me say hello to her and thank her for testifying at the hearings. And I walked in and said hello, and she said, and so we started talking, and we were having a very good visit, and a fight broke out. And the young people at that group, including Mr. Brightman, with some of his students and his followers, were saying that police don't come when Indians have fights. They don't come and police that street. They don't. They arrive at 4 o'clock and pick up the drunks, the drunk Indians, and take them off. But when there's any disturbance, that they don't even come and help. And I thought, well, they're being dramatic, a little over enthusiastic about the description. Well, I had my share of there that night because there wasn't a minute that there was, the people in our group would have protected me, but there was a time when that my life was in danger. And no police showed up till an hour later. And then they tried to arrest the people that were in my group who were complaining about what was happening. Some people who were Samoans who were there. And later this really erupted into kind of a gang war situation, and there's an young Indian man in the hospital today with unconscious and with no mind because he was so severely beaten. But those are the kinds of situations you find in the cities, and the jobs are not, they go and they probably will lose their first job, and then they can't find the next one. And it just gets worse and worse. They don't know how to go to the welfare agency, or, they're not accustomed. They're usually used to working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or they don't know how to get housing. We found that in most of the places they had the poorest housing and the poorest jobs, the lowest income jobs of any of the peoples in the state. Most arrested in San Francisco, I think it was like they have, just say there's 1% Indians in the San Francisco area, and like 40% arrest and 30% convictions. You just go on and on and on, and you can't tell me that Indians are should be more arrested than anybody else. But one thing they don't know, their civil rights and their legal rights. And the law has been an enemy and not a friend. And again, an Indian would probably admit to being guilty, even whether he is or not, just to avoid any confrontation with the police or the judge, and all kinds of things. He really doesn't know his civil rights. He doesn't know the law. The law is really a foreign thing to him, even from the state of Oklahoma, where we're not on reservations. And you can imagine coming from a reservation into the city and try to make those kinds of adjustments, or even from the hills in eastern Oklahoma, the kinds of adjustments you'd have to make. So one of the other cities, I'll give you an example. We went to Dallas and had held hearings there. And when we arrived at the city, and they said, well, Mrs. Harris, and of course I was, one good thing being married to my husband is that I do get some attention from, help focus attention from from the local press. So when I arrived there, all the city fathers said, there are no Indians. There are only 300 Indians in the city of Dallas. Why are you bothering to come to Dallas? And I said, well, I know that I have more relatives here than that. So, and they laughed and they said, oh, really? And so we got to checking around, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs said there was something like 7,000 to 8,000. And so if they say that, you can come to determine that there must be around 10 to 12,000 Indian families there. So we had hearings, but it was shocking. The community action people didn't know that there were Indian peoples in Dallas. All the agencies, the welfare, the employment. I think there was just one black guy that who worked in employment kind of way out in the, in the area, that even had any idea that there were any numbers of Indians there. So these are the kinds of problems that, the worst part about it, and I think that's what Alcatraz is all about, the screaming out of saying that we, as Indian people, we're here in a city, we're here and somewhat lost, and we want to be recognized as Indians, and we want, have a part of this community. We want to be a part of it in a real meaningful way, and not down on Mission Street or Skid Row or wherever. But I think that's really the outcry of Dallas. And like I told you, that one of the recommendations that came out of those hearings were to ask that the relocation program at least be stopped, to make some stronger evaluations about how successful that program was, because in the idea that it was doing more damage than it was good, that it was actually hurting more people than it was helping, just on the failure aspect. So, but of course, no one's really paid attention to that recommendation. But there are all kinds of, now there are, as I say, some government agencies that are that are saying they're going to have a program, but as yet have not developed one. Being on, the interesting thing, one of the things that it's so hard for, I guess maybe non-minority people to understand is, I just, every day, and particularly it's interesting that people who could march in the civil rights marches and everything cannot understand why Indian people and black people and Chicano groups, just even by the name Chicanos, are saying, leave us alone and go educate yourself and, let us do our thing. And I know it's hurtful to most people who have felt like they've made a contribution, particularly in civil rights, to hear black people say that and Indian people say, let us do it, let us do it. Give us a chance to make our mistakes, that surely we couldn't have made any more mistakes than you have. And so I think that's kind of really the message in what Indian people are all about. And the interesting thing, I mentioned earlier to you, I'm not tying this together very well, but I hope you'll ask me questions if I'm skipping, that because of this tribal rivalry and the tribal politics is really something. You think the Democratic Party fights each other, you should see Indians fight each other. They, just kind of, it's a growing process in my opinion, and I think it's one of the things we've not had a chance to play a leadership role and do the kinds of things that we wanted to do. And so all of this, if we fight one another, I think that's all right. If we don't, as long as we don't hurt each other, in that regard, hurt the whole Indians in general. But it's part of the growing up stages, not growing up stages rather, but part of development, that we're trying to learn to do things for ourselves because we've become so dependent because of the federal government, churches, and all other institutions that have made life contributed to our self-image, that we are peoples who are really kind of incapable. You can't imagine kind of the stories that come out of young people. Our Indian Youth Council in Oklahoma, when we tried, one of the things we wanted to get to was why were we having so many dropouts? You all know that we have more dropouts than any other minority groups or any ethnic group in the country. And why is that so? When we have a government agency who's looking after us, why do we have the poorest health in the country when we're the only group of people who have a special agency? So I think you really have to come at it's not an Indian problem, it's a non-Indian problem. The attitude of the non-Indian toward the Indian has caused these kinds of problems, because children, when we were talking about dropouts, for instance, we had young people. We started off with high school kids. But if they stayed in high school, if they were juniors and seniors in high school, they had some defense mechanism already set up protecting, which said, I'm not discriminated against because I'm an Indian, and they could say all kinds of things. And so we never could find out anything. So we took the 5th and 6th grade young people, and one little girl said, I know why we drop out of school. And we said, why? And she said, because we can't make good grades in school. And I said, why? What do you say that? And said, well, I don't know anyone that can make B's or A's who are Indians. And I said, well, that's not so. This little girl right next to you makes straight A's. But she was, something made her believe that some of her experience made her believe that Indians were incapable of making A's. And Indians get where we feel that we can't do certain kinds of things. And so, and it's reinforced by many actions that continue to happen every day and still happen. In our state, we have this big problem of Little Red. Little Red is the mascot at the University of Oklahoma, and he's an Indian. Or he is now an Indian. He used to be just a non-Indian dressed up in an Indian costume, and he would dance at halftime of football games. So when some of the Indian students objected, the university, then the university president, said that they would do away with it. Well, we've never had a more controversial issue in the state of Oklahoma. Every OU alumni in the state just wrote, and Hene was telling me that it got the award for the biggest headline in Oklahoma. And so Winfred, and people couldn't understand. They'd come to me and say, what is your feeling on Little Red? And I said, well, I object to him. And I said, if it embarrasses the students, I particularly object to it. And said, it embarrasses me to watch him dance because he doesn't know how to dance. But they don't know, see, they don't know the difference. And he may be lately I guess the last two have been Kiowas. But I was thinking that they usually dress up somebody, and maybe an eastern Oklahoma dressed up in Plains Indians clothes, But that just shows you how insensitive they are. But they reinstated Little Red, and so one of my Indian girlfriends said, well, if you really wanted something symbolically to represent Oklahoma, you should have a little redneck get out and dance along with Little Red. But those are the kinds of things, and they seem little in many people's minds, but those are the kinds of things that reinforces one's self-image. And after a while, you may even get to hating yourself, and when you get to hating yourself, you might destroy yourself. And as you may have read, and many of all the facts are showing now, which was totally unheard of like 5 years ago, that the Indian suicide rate, particularly young Indians, suicide was really virtually unheard of within the Indian community. And now the suicide rate among Indians has skyrocketed past any other group in the country. And it's higher among Indian students going to Indian boarding schools. And yet we don't change those Indian boarding schools at all. We continue on in the same kind of horrible way. And when there was an investigation in one of the boarding schools, and they said that there was physical cruelty. And so senators ran down and looked at this boarding school, and they said there were no physical cruelty, but they didn't look into the mental cruelty where children are killing themselves. And so those are kinds of things I want to tell you tonight. And all of that, if you can imagine all of that kind of background and those attitudes that young people receive even within the Indian community, what would it be like within an urban community? And so your coming here to this kind of program is really important, because you are the people that need to be educated, and you're the people that are going to have to solve the problem of the non-Indian problem, rather, and not the Indian problem. So thank you very much.
Mrs. Harris, I know that I speak for all of us when I thank you for the most informative presentation. I'm certain we have all learned a great deal about the Indian, particularly in our urban centers. As I indicated before, Mrs. Harris has kindly consented to answer some questions so that things that she has said that may have raised your interest with regard to Indians in urban areas and other things, she will be very happy to answer questions at this time. Question in front here.
The question was what would, in my opinion, be the top priority priorities in the urban centers. I would say, first of all, is to give Alcatraz back to the Indians, and then try to because that is symbolic of the frustration of the urban Indian. And then try to reinforce the centers as much as you can, and making it a diversified organization where they can get information about jobs, housing, health, and so they learn, which would make life easier in the cities. And I would say that would be that you would have a unit that the Indian centers would not only provide socialization but also forms of information. Should the centers be federally funded? It seems that's the only way that they could be. There are some centers that get some red feather funds and others, but that goes back and forth, and it's not stable. And I would like to see them be federally funded, say, through OEO and not through BIA. And, just kind of break it out, or HEW even, and kind of break it out of the BIA-MO. In my criticism of the BIA, I'd like to say that I don't criticize it. I think it reflects the total attitude of the general public, that the lack of accomplishment of the BIA, though I think it has improved some. There are many good Indian young men now working there, and that there are trying to develop some new programs. But I think it really is reflective of the Congress. And you just can't imagine. I was telling Nancy about coming in from the airport about the Taos legislation. But let me tell you that story just to give you some sort of background. You may have heard about the Taos lands, the Blue Lake lands, which is a religious shrine, the Taos Indian Pueblo. And for something like 60 years, the Taos Indians have been wanting to get, it was taken away under something by the federal government. And it gave them the right to use the lake, but the agriculture department had authority over it, and they were running cattle in it, and they were doing all kinds of things there. And so the Pueblo Indian were asking for trust title to the property, which was that similar to their own Pueblo. And for 60 years, they tried to get the Congress to pass some legislation. They got the House of Representatives to pass it twice. It stayed in the Committee of Interior on the Senate side for 16 years because one man would not let it out of committee. And this last year, congressional year, we worked on it, and you can't imagine. It was something like everybody, it was probably the only Indian issue that all the tribes endorsed, and which is a big thing. And all Indian organizations endorsed, and we even had the Japanese Americans endorse it. You can imagine what kind of public support it had for it, but it wouldn't get out of the committee. And we were told it wouldn't get out. And so then we harassed around, it sounds a little selfish on my part because my husband played a big role in it, but after just kind of using, just really kind of having a knockdown, drag-out fight with about 2 senators, and then holding up every piece of legislation that would come out of the Interior Committee, couldn't be brought on the floor until Taos was. He had to use tactics like that, tactics that are negative to good legislation. And they had a secret meeting in the Indian subcommittee of the Interior, passed it out of that, got it, they passed it with an amendment that was not acceptable to the Taos people. But at least we said it's out of that subcommittee. Then it got into the full committee, and it still passed. Then they had another secret meeting, not even a public meeting, which is curious in itself. And they passed it out of that and got on the floor with this amendment onto it. But fortunately, a group of us had done enough work that we got enough support from members of the Senate that we overrode the committee report, which is very, very rare. In fact, it was the first time in the history of Congress that the Interior Committee had ever been overridden, and particularly with Indians. An awful thing that you would see, and again, is kind of when I'm saying that not only is the Bureau's fault for failure, I'm saying, it's a general attitude or lack of knowledge, but there are members of the Senate who would say things like, why are you coming to, asking my husband, why are you coming to help Indians in New Mexico? These are my Indians. I know what's good for my Indians, said I wouldn't go over there and mess with your Indians in Oklahoma. But this is a general attitude, and that they're traded off like timber, or and of course it's in that Interior Committee, but it's really like lakes or river rights or whatever. It's traded off like that, and that's what the opposition was. That members of the Senate who voted against it, particularly in committee, was that, my goodness, if we vote for the Taos thing, they may come over here and do something with my Indians. And that was really the biggest kind of opposition that we had. But fortunately, it was passed, and at the meeting took bipartisan efforts too. It was just really remarkable. And everybody said, how did the groups of people ever get together to pass it? So after it was passed, and they was having a press conference on it, and they said, gosh, somebody said, boy, the system finally works. And somebody said, yes, it only takes every tribe in the United States endorsement and every Indian organization, 2 strong United States senators, and President of the United States making a statement on it, and the system finally, and 60 years of struggle from the Taos people and 16 years, and, then the system works. But that's kind of, it's what I'm saying is that even Congress knows so little. And, says awful things about our educational system. How little is known, and I think perhaps if we could use Indians, that maybe we could, really have a better understanding of all peoples. If we studied Indians rightfully in American history, in the history of this continent. But it's, the attitude of peoples are just really just remarkable, and the kinds of questions that you get, speaking to the general public. And you can understand why there's such bitterness within, why there is such a sense of militancy now growing within the Indian community, particularly with young people. Well, that's usually the case. The question was that this young man is from the Des Moines, Iowa Indian Center, and so he was wondering. He said, we're one of the groups that don't know how to apply for federal funds. Well, really, right now there's a lot of talk about federal funds being available, but they're not really there. But I think that there are some things you can do, and I think you can go and get maybe Red Feather or get some kind of, and linking up with the universities. University faculty could help you. They were some faculty members at the University of Oklahoma, very few, but a great many. Some helped, and it made us more successful in our Indian organization work. But I could talk to you afterwards and maybe give you some suggestions on how to do it. But I wouldn't feel awkward about it because nobody really knows. And it's just, I know that I had awful arguments with OEO and with Rumsfeld's people about their obligation to help finance the Indian centers as part of their OEO programs, but I think it's going to happen. But I think we need to keep writing in and asking and keep the pressure on. Hopefully not 60 years.
Really, in some ways, working against them instead of for maybe very to a.
Well, it hasn't. Yeah, Well, the question was, does this separateness wouldn't this really be work against Indian people? The only answer I can say to that the other hasn't worked. Trying to integrate certainly hasn't worked. We haven't really fared by that. So, I think being separate in the sense that you have strength enough to do what you want to do, then if you can do the things you want to do, but trying the kinds of programs which the government had officially, that was their program. The treatment to the Indian was to integrate them and assimilate them, but it didn't. It hasn't worked, and and then it's taken away all the self-pride and dignity of the Indian. Then you'd have nothing. You have a lost individual. So certainly it seemed like at least the separateness would give a sense of pride and belonging to something. And I think we all need that, or we wouldn't wear those shamrocks on St. Patrick's Day or do our little German dances or whatever. We need to belong to something, and I think, separateness is supposedly what this country's all about. We say that, but we don't allow it, particularly if for dark-skinned people, we don't allow that.
Maybe we ought to change the American dream of the United States being the melting pot of the world, and maybe we talk about it being the fruitcake of the world, where we can maintain the identities of all different individuals in one unit.
Well, I think it might not be a bad idea. Did y'all hear the question? Or there was a comment. He said, we might give up the American dream of the melting pot. The interesting thing, nobody melts if you're dark skinned. You don't melt into the melting pot if your skin's dark. But and he said, you know, maybe we should retain our identities and be separate. And I think it might be a good thing. We might learn how to live in this world if we knew how to get along with Indian people and allow them to be different, our Chicanos particularly. I agree. This was said that she felt that it would be terrible if we lost this identity, but it's the interesting thing, we want it, but yet we're threatened by it too. I don't know exactly why. We want it, but we won't allow it, which is interesting. And it's not just the harsh people. You know, sometimes I think it's in some ways easier to be black than it is an Indian, because a black, if you're discriminated against or your things happen to you, at least you have some idea of why it's happening to you. In India, nobody admits being discriminating against an Indian. And just even in our own minds, and even with, quotes, good people, church people who probably do as much damage as anybody, just going out and being just openly discriminating against people, because this patronizing attitude and this condescending attitude is much more damaging psychologically to people, and particularly to children. And this is what happens, and I've seen, we love our Indian children. I used to go to schools in Oklahoma where they'd say, Mrs. Harris is coming, so we have to have an Indian program. I was going to present them with some books, and they make some poor Creek boy dress up with a Kiowa headdress, and just humiliate him. And you just want to hit them in the mouth for what they do. But that kind of thing is twice as, just as damaging as outright verbal abuse. Because you don't know how to cope with it in lots of ways, and maybe you're not experienced enough.
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, LaDonna Harris, Comanche member of the National Council for Indian Opportunities and wife of Senator Fred Harris, spoke on urban Indians. This was the 6th in a series of 9 programs recorded at Iowa State University's National Affairs Institute devoted to the American Indian. University Lecture is a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.